She was launched in 1913. By the time the Second World War began, she was 24 years old. Her steering gear had been unreliable since a shell hit at the Battle of Jutland, and her fire control architecture was a generation behind the ships the Royal Navy was commissioning to replace her. On paper, HMS Warspite was manageable. No German captain ever wanted to find out what she actually was. That gap between specification and reality is the entire story. Because by the time Axis naval commanders sat down with their charts and plotted their movements through the Mediterranean and the North Sea, the name HMS Warspite carried a weight that no technical assessment could fully explain. A Queen Elizabeth-class battleship that should have been a second-tier asset had become something no shipyard could manufacture. A reputation so thoroughly proven across so many engagements that intelligence of her presence in a theatre altered operational planning before a single gun was trained. The primitive framing isn't entirely wrong, it's just incomplete. Axis commanders made the mistake of stopping at the label. 15 battle honours, that is the official count attached to her name, the highest total in Royal Navy history, running from Jutland in 1916 to the Walcheren landings. She served across 2 world wars and more theatres than most capital ships encounter in their entire commissioned lives. The Royal Navy called her the Grand Old Lady, an affectionate designation that acknowledged her age, her history, and the particular authority that accumulates on a ship that has been surviving for decades. The nickname was fondly meant. It also contained an assumption that her age was her dominant characteristic, that her limitations were the first and final facts about her. She wasn't manageable. The Queen Elizabeth class had been exceptional when it was built. Part of the 1912-13 naval estimates, these 5 ships were designed to carry 8 15-inch guns. Warspite launched on November 26, 1913, and entered service in March 1915. She arrived just in time for Jutland. On May 31, 1916, a German shell struck her port wing engine room. The impact drove something into the steering mechanism. A hot bearing developed, and the steering engine began to labour whenever she turned to port. The yard repaired it. The problem never entirely went away. For the remaining 3 decades of her operational life, that mechanical stutter was always present, a physical inheritance from the Jutland guns that had found her in the North Sea. A capital warship, one of the most powerful in the fleet, with a rudder that needed management. The modernisation programme between March 1934 and March 1937 gave her a second claim on relevance. It cost £2,363,000, a figure approaching the price of new construction. A second funnel was added. What the modernisation couldn't provide was what newer ships had from the keel up: modern fire control architecture. Warspite carried the Admiralty Fire Control Table Mark VII, an electromechanical system that was sophisticated for 1913. By 1939, the King George V class battleships arriving to succeed her were receiving the Mark IX. Bismarck, commissioned May 1941, carried 3 independent fire control computers with multiple backup sensor systems. Warspite's crew worked with equipment the Admiralty's own engineers regarded as aging. They made it perform to standards those engineers hadn't anticipated. Speed had also degraded from her original design profile. The mechanical idiosyncrasies accumulated over decades meant sustained high-speed operations were a calculation, not a guarantee. She was, by any objective fleet comparison in 1939, the ship you assigned when you had no better option, and then watched perform better than the ship you'd wished you had. One of the defining demonstrations of her gunnery came on July 9, 1940, at 15:59, in the waters off Calabria. The Mediterranean fleet was engaging an Italian naval force. A single 15-inch shell from Warspite struck the Italian battleship Giulio Cesare on her rear deck. Range approximately 26,000 yards, roughly 15 miles, across open water against a moving target. Hitting a ship at that range with aging fire control equipment sits among the longest-range naval gunfire hits ever recorded in combat. The Giulio Cesare felt it. Her entire crew felt it. Every Italian admiral in the Mediterranean processed what that impact communicated. This ship could reach you from distances that were supposed to be safe. The round didn't sink the Giulio Cesare. The message was delivered in full regardless. 9 months later, at Cape Matapan, Warspite demonstrated that range was only the first half of what her crews could do. The night of 28th to 29th March 1941. Admiral Cunningham's fleet had manoeuvred into position around a disabled Italian force in the eastern Mediterranean. The heavy cruiser Pola lay stationary in the water. Her sisters, Zara and Fiume, Zara-class heavy cruisers, well-armed and capable vessels, had been sent back to assist. In the darkness, they had no warning of what surrounded them. At 22:27:55, Warspite opened fire. At 22:28, 5 seconds later, her shells found Fiume. The cruiser burst into flames along her full length almost instantaneously. 5 seconds from the order to fire to a heavy cruiser burning across its entire hull, in complete darkness, against a crew that had no warning, a firing solution was already established. The Italian sailors aboard Fiume had no interval between Warspite's muzzle flash and the impact of 15-inch shells tearing through their ship. No time, no response. 5 seconds. That performance didn't come from superior hardware. It came from what the crew had built around inadequate hardware. And the technical story behind those 5 seconds is, if anything, more revealing than the gunnery statistics themselves. Warspite had received a Type 2 7-9 radar set, but the official integration between that radar and the Admiralty fire control table hadn't been fully engineered at the Admiralty level. The ship's staff solved the problem themselves. They rigged a telephonic link between the radar office and the 15-inch gun transmitting station, then tuned the fire control table so that the true range input fed directly from the radar data. An official report recorded the outcome in prose that was considerably drier than the action deserved. The AFC table being tuned so that true range was set to RDF range. The broadside was seen to hit. The Admiralty didn't design that solution. The men aboard Warspite invented it at sea, because the ship they served required them to be better than the equipment they'd been issued. That improvised link was the technical margin at Matapan. The 5-second hit was its product. Zara and Pola followed Fiume to the bottom before the night ended. 3 heavy cruisers in a single darkness engagement against a force that had no meaningful opportunity to respond. The Italian Navy never again sought active engagement with British forces in open Mediterranean waters with the same confidence it had carried into that night. The damage to operational morale within the Regia Marina was significant and enduring. Not because Matapan had been close, but precisely because it hadn't. The disparity was clinical. Matapan wasn't, in the end, a near thing. Its ease was the message. But for all its cold precision, Matapan wasn't the engagement that made German officers revise their charts. For that, you have to go back 11 months earlier. You have to go to Norway and a fjord that runs 48 miles into the mountains. 13th April 1940. 4 days after Germany's invasion of Norway, a British force under Admiral William Whitworth was tasked with eliminating a German destroyer flotilla that had retreated into the Ofot fjord after earlier fighting. 8 Z-class destroyers sheltered there. They had the terrain. The fjord's narrow confines and steep surrounding peaks made it exactly the kind of water where a large warship became a liability, and torpedo-armed destroyers had every advantage. Cover, local knowledge, multiple firing angles, and the simple geometry of confinement. Tactical doctrine existed to warn against this scenario. Battleships didn't go up fjords. The turning radius was wrong. The exposure was wrong. The risk calculus was wrong. A capital ship in confined waters was vulnerable from multiple angles simultaneously. And one torpedo hit in a channel with no withdrawal space could strand the fleet's most powerful unit with no possibility of escape. Warspite's steering gear, still carrying that Jutland bearing, still unreliable on port turns, added its own variable to an already unfavourable equation. Any sensible staff assessment would have recommended keeping the capital ship at the fjord entrance and letting destroyers do the close work. Whitworth ordered Warspite in regardless. She sent her Fairy Swordfish floatplane ahead. The Swordfish located U-64 and dive-bombed it. The submarine sank immediately. The first U-boat destroyed by aircraft in the entire war, and the only instance in the whole conflict of a battleship-launched aircraft sinking a submarine. One floatplane from an aging battleship, and a unique entry in the record of naval aviation, before Warspite's main guns had fired a single round. Then Warspite moved up the fjord. Z-13, Erich Kölner, was sunk by Warspite and her escorts in the opening exchanges. The other German destroyers attempted to use the terrain, pressing the advantages that confined water was supposed to give them. It wasn't enough. By the close of the 13th of April 1940, all 8 of the German Z-class destroyers sheltering in the Ofot fjord had been sunk or scuttled. An entire flotilla. The British force had gone in and come out, and the fjord was empty of German warships. Those 8 destroyers weren't a minor element of Germany's Norwegian naval campaign. They were the core of it. Their loss eliminated Germany's surface naval capability in Norwegian waters at the precise moment that capability was needed to contest Allied movements in the north. The Kriegsmarine had committed those ships to the Norway operation and lost them entirely in a single afternoon to a British capital ship that had no reasonable business operating in that geography. German Naval Command wasn't looking at an ordinary defeat. They were looking at a British battleship that had sailed into terrain that maximised its vulnerabilities, operated against its own mechanical limitations, ignored every standard argument for keeping capital ships away from confined waters, and come out with all 8 opponents destroyed and a submarine sunk for additional measure. The mathematics of what Warspite was supposed to be, old, slow, mechanically compromised, didn't match the mathematics of what had just happened in the Ofot fjord. What made this register as something beyond a tactical victory was its character. A ship that should have been manageable had not been managed. A ship that doctrine said to avoid fjords had operated in a fjord and cleaned it out. The gap between what she was supposed to be capable of and what she had just demonstrated she was willing to do, that gap didn't have a ready explanation in any technical assessment. Fear doesn't always track the mathematics of force comparison. Sometimes it follows the evidence of what a thing has already proved it will do. The documented record doesn't yield a Kriegsmarine war diary entry specifically naming Warspite as the reason to cancel an operation or alter a sortie route. That level of direct primary confirmation hasn't surfaced in the available sources. What the record does show is that Axis operational planning tracked specific British capital ships as threat variables, and that a ship with Warspite's demonstrated record occupied a particular category in those assessments. Not simply dangerous if engaged, which applied to any battleship. Something more specific. A vessel whose operational performance had consistently exceeded what her material profile suggested she could achieve, in multiple theatres, under multiple conditions, against multiple opponents. That characteristic, unpredictability backed by a proven record, was more operationally disruptive than raw tonnage. When intelligence placed her in a theatre, the rational adjustment wasn't to seek engagement. A ship that had done what Warspite had done didn't need to be encountered to influence a plan. Her known position was itself a variable that altered the geometry of what was worth attempting. The evidence stops well short of proving specific Kriegsmarine missions were cancelled because of her name alone. But the broader pattern of Axis operational caution in theatres where she was known to be operating is consistent with a fleet that had absorbed what she had already proved. British forces experienced the same effect from the other direction. Other ships in the fleet noted what happened to morale when Warspite's profile appeared on the horizon, the particular quality of reassurance that moved through a formation at the sight of her. Her rebuilt silhouette, that second funnel added in the 1930s, the sheer bulk of a ship that had been fighting since before half the Kriegsmarine's officers had joined the Navy, communicated something that no briefing could replicate. A personal record, visible and known. Whatever a German captain understood about her age and her limitations, that silhouette in the distance was the counter-argument. By September 1943, she was 28 years old. Operation Avalanche, the Allied landings at Salerno, was one more assignment. Naval gunfire support for troops going ashore on the Italian mainland. The Luftwaffe produced the answer that the Kriegsmarine hadn't managed to deliver. A Fritz X guided bomb, a precision munition representing the frontier of mid-century weapons development, struck her. A 1913 vintage battleship absorbing a weapon that didn't exist when she was designed, a piece of technology from a different era of warfare entirely. She didn't sink. The Fritz X hit reduced her to limited operational capacity. She served out the remainder of the war in a diminished role, paid off when the fighting ended, and was sold for scrapping in 1947. While being towed to the breakers, she ran aground off Cornwall. It took years to break her up, where she had grounded on the Cornish coast. Whether that is poetic is a matter of personal interpretation. What it certainly is consistent with everything she had done before it. 15 battle honours weren't given to this ship. They were extracted from 28 years of service by crews who treated every limitation as a problem to engineer around, rather than an excuse to accept. The improvised radar link at Matapan was that philosophy in its most literal form. The official system wasn't adequate, so the men aboard rigged a better one from available parts and a telephone cable. The Narvik action was the same philosophy at operational scale. Doctrine said, "Don't take a capital ship up a fjord," and Whitworth's force went anyway, because the crew was confident enough in their training and their guns to accept risks that the ship's specification said they shouldn't take. Warspite's Admiralty fire control table was a Mark 7 when the fleet was fitting Mark 9s. Her steering had laboured on port turns since 1916. Her speed was compromised by decades of hard service. Bismarck came into service with 3 independent fire control systems and purpose-built redundancy. Warspite's crew linked their radar to their guns with a telephone line they had rigged themselves. Every technical comparison worked against her. She had 15 battle honours and a reputation that travelled considerably further than her shells. The most powerful weapon HMS Warspite ever carried wasn't calibrated in inches. It was the name painted on her hull. And by the middle years of the war, that name appearing in an intelligence summary was enough to alter the geometry of an Axis operation. Not because of what she might do in theory, because of what she had already demonstrated across multiple theatres against multiple opponents in conditions that were supposed to work against her. 8 destroyers in a fjord, 3 heavy cruisers in complete darkness, a 15-mile hit on a moving target in open sea, a guided bomb absorbed and survived. She earned every hour of what they were afraid of. Subscribe for more stories like this.